Recency bias is a cognitive bias that favors recent events over historic ones. It's a memory bias. Recency bias gives a greater importance to the most recent event. And lately, I've been seeing so many people forget just who and what exactly Gojo Satoru is exactly about. So in this video, I'm gonna remind you, and I'm gonna help you understand that if and when Gojo does fight Sukuna, it is not gonna be the one-sided mollywhopping people seem to think it is gonna be. In fact, it will be much closer to one of the best fights that we have ever seen in the series. With the recent chapter of Jujutsu Kaisen heavily featuring Gojo and the prison realm, JJK is really driving home the idea that our white-haired, hollow-thrown, blue-casted, infinity-dwelling, limitless-wielding powerhouse might be back home sooner than we'd all hope. So naturally, the fans have got themselves incredibly excited for the potential of Jujutsu Kaisen's King of Cases versus the Honored One himself. And one thing that I've been seeing a lot of is, how is Gojo going to deal with Sukuna? Sukuna with the 10 shadows is too powerful. Sukuna has Megami's body. Sukuna has to have fat cock. Wait, hold up. Maybe not that last part. But you know who does have a fat cock? You, when you click that subscribe button. I've heard that if you subscribe to this YouTube channel right now, you get at least 120% increase in fat cock potential. That's just what I'm hearing on the reports. Anyway, since chapter 212, we have seen so much of Sukuna. We've seen Sukuna take over Megami's body, summon new, a new that looked like fucking Mothra. That motherfucker was throwing lightning bolts around like Zeus. Used the 10 shadows technique in ways that we've never even seen before, and seen him summon 2 new Shikigamis with the Madoka Deer, who was able to use RCT and seemingly disperse cased energy from techniques, and then Pearson Ox, which is a bull that can only move in a straight line, but the longer the line traveled, the harder the attack. And on top of both of these 2 new Shikigami, Sukuna also showed off the Mahoraga 2.0. He was able to summon the Dharma Chakra wheel above his head without fully manifesting the Mahoraga's actual body, and this eventually allowed Sukuna to tank attacks from his opponents and allowed the Mahoraga to adapt to them without actually being present. And this essentially would allow Sukuna to fight in a manner similar to Katsu, creating an almost 2v1 fight, allowing him to fight side by side with the Mahoraga here, and probably because he's gonna need it against Gojo, if I'm honest here. Listen, if I am completely honest, Sukuna pre-10 Shadows would have had trouble against Gojo. Let's be real here. Gojo's Infinity, if I am completely and utterly honest here, unless Sukuna was hiding more techniques that weren't offensive techniques up his arsenal, then it's more than likely that Sukuna couldn't have done much to get past Gojo's Infinity technique, and I'm pretty sure Sukuna's Flame wasn't gonna get past that, and neither was Cleave or Dismantle. The best way we can compare Gojo and Sukuna is through a common opponent that they've both fought. Sukuna and Gojo have both fought Jogo. Unfortunately, Jogo is the father of the series, and while he is a powerful cursed disaster spirit, he just so happens to have fought the 2 absolute mutant powerhouses of the series, and both of them absolutely railed this man, and I think we can all agree on this. However, I'd be willing to argue that Gojo's fight against Jogo and Hanami was a little bit more impressive of the 2, considering the situation Gojo was put into. And before you confuse what I mean here, let me explain. Sukuna's attacks looked more visibly impressive. He literally decimated the landscape of Shibuya. He caused way more destruction, but he was also able to fight freely. And then there's Gojo's fight with Jogo and Hanami was more impressive as far as I'm concerned, in terms of him holding off multiple special grades by himself, and in the sense of the situation he was put into. That whole situation was made to capture Gojo and limit what he was able to do during these set encounters. Jogo and Hanami's plan revolved around limiting what Gojo was able to do in a confined space. Recognizing that Gojo would be cautious in how he fights with civilians around, Jogo and Hanami used a technique known as domain amplification, and as Gojo says himself, with this method Gojo was now vulnerable to their attacks. And in case you all forgot, Kenjaku's plan to move forward Gojo needed to be sealed. This kind of implication alone is open to interpretation. However, I would be more than willing to bet that Kenjaku understood with Gojo on the loose, he would have absolutely handled the 15-finger Sukuna should he have been released in Shibuya while Gojo was present. And like I previously said, anything Sukuna had in his offensive arsenal to throw at Gojo would have most likely not get past Gojo's Infinity technique. But now Sukuna has a hold of the 10 Shadows technique, a technique known and stated by Gojo to have stalemated a previous Limitless 6 Eyes user just like Gojo. That fight between Gojo and Sukuna becomes a lot more close when you know this information now. And while I'm well aware Jogo and Hanami are nowhere even near the levels of Gojo and Sukuna, the fact that Gojo vaporized Hanami simply by strengthening the output from from his Infinity Curse technique is impressive in and of itself when you remember that Hanami was the most durable of the special grade disaster curses, even tanking multiple black flashes from Yuji. But Gojo's Infinity turned Hanami into tree paste. They literally turned Hanami into a Banksy painting against the walls of Shibuya train station. Gojo managed this while fighting in between humans and handling both attacks from Jogo and Hanami at the same time. And if you don't understand what I'm saying here, I'm saying that Gojo managed to push back a Hanami and Jogo in this situation with sheer brain power and manipulation of his opponent, making them both think that he had let his guard down. And granted, this is most likely would never ever work on Sukuna, but the fact that we have seen both Gojo and Sukuna manipulate their opponent's mental state mid-fight is something I find very interesting, because remember, Sukuna also did a similar thing with Hana and Angel, pretending that Angel's technique had worked and invited Hana down to hug him, with her thinking he had returned to being Megami, only to then rip a chunk out of her side. We've seen many other characters in the series create little traps for people to fall in, but never have we seen someone manipulate someone's mental state or emotional state in the same way that Gojo and Sukuna are both done to their previous opponents. The mental warfare and the emotional warfare from these two is actually insane. Surely after Gojo turned Hanami into a Banksy mural, he had this man Jogo running scared. And I'm just gonna say, Sukuna did not have Jogo actively running from him like this. Sure, Jogo might have been fighting on the back foot the entire fight, but this man Jogo was running genuinely scared away from Gojo right here. Like, look at the fear in this man's eyeball. This scene alone reminded me so much of Yuji and Mahito when Mahito was being chased down. And then we have to look at the domain expansions. Similar to Sukuna, Gojo has done something that only one other person has done in the series. While Sukuna and Kenjaku are the only two confirmed users of a barrierless domain, both of which have their own advantage, Gojo and Mahito are the only two people in the series who have both used domain expansions that span 0.2 seconds. And this feat alone allowed Gojo to stun lock everyone in the Shibuya basement, and he figured out that just 0.2 seconds would have flooded a non-sorcerer's brain with half a year's worth of information. It's a popular theory among the fan base here that had Mahito survived the Shibuya instance and continued to grow, that Mahito would be a very, very serious problem for even the upper tiers of any Jujutsu sorcerer, Gojo himself included. Gojo managed to annihilate around 1,000 transfigured humans within 299 seconds while everyone was stun locked from this domain. And many people have wondered why Gojo hasn't shown a barrierless domain. They theorized that because Sukuna used his and it was deemed a divine technique, that Gojo's domain in comparison would be weaker. But I would argue that the applications of both domains differ, and Gojo's wouldn't really benefit from a barrierless domain in the same way Sukuna's does. Gojo's domain has a sure hit effect on the mind, whereas Sukuna's attacks anyone and anything until it is done destroying anything in its path. So the effects of these two are vastly different, with both sure hit attacks. And when it comes down to how a domain battle between Gojo and Sukuna goes, many people would believe that Gojo would lose to Sukuna having an open domain, but again, I would be inclined to argue against this. We know Sukuna has an immense amount of cursed energy here. However, Gojo's cursed energy usage for his techniques is infinitely close to zero, meaning he expends almost zero cursed energy, meaning Gojo could use his domain expansion multiple times in one day, I can only assume here. And if it was the case that Sukuna did manage to catch Gojo inside his domain, there is one small piece of information that a lot of people have overlooked here, and that is because when Naobito fought Dagon inside of Dagon's domain, Naobito used a really unique anti-domain technique known as the Falling Blossom Emotion, and this is a technique that was passed down in the big three Jujutsu families, and we now know that Gojo Clan is also one of those big three Jujutsu families. And this technique, unlike a simple domain, doesn't expand its own domain, and instead it counter attacks with cursed energy the moment the can't miss attack makes contact. And in this case, Naobito uses it to defend against Dagon's sure hit attack, which by the way is an attack that doesn't exist until it makes contact, making it an instant hit. Not just a sure hit, but an instant hit. Basically the dartboard Nen ability from Hunter x Hunter, if you are familiar with it. And we know Sukuna's cleave and dismantle can be deflected because we saw this happen when the mahoraga adapted to it and deflect the attack. He could then see it and deflect it. So knowing both these pieces of information, I think it is a safe bet to say that Gojo, if he did get caught in Sukuna's malevolent shrine, he has these two options available to him. Number one, Fallen Blossom Emotion to deflect the counter attack of cleave and dismantle attacks. Or number 2, teleport outside of Sukuna's domain and leave its effective range. We know Sukuna can cast a domain of 200 meters, and we've seen Gojo use teleportation before. If Gojo's range is greater than the range of the domain, he can simply just leave the area, and that is most likely one of the biggest problems with an open barrier domain for someone like Gojo here. When you go back and reread the story, Gojo has been shown to be proficient in everything. He needs to defeat Sukuna, and the difference maker here now is the 10 Shadows technique and Sukuna's application of it. Shikigami like the Mahoraga and Madoka Dia used in combination with each other could be a severe problem for Gojo to deal with. For example, if Madoka Dia can neutralize Gojo's infinity technique, then Gojo would be open to Mahoraga's attacks, and then you might be wondering why couldn't just Mahoraga just adapt to Gojo's infinity technique anyway? And I would be inclined to believe and argue that Mahoraga only adapts to techniques used against Mahoraga as the target, and since infinity isn't a technique that attacks a target and instead just guards Gojo and can expand on Gojo's command, I would probably make the argument that it doesn't deal any damage to Mahoraga, and therefore Mahoraga wouldn't be able to adapt to it. But overall, Gojo has been shown to be one powerful motherfucker, and I believe this fight between Gojo and Sukuna would be way closer than people realize, and I don't think either one of these powerhouses is getting no diff at all. And if you believe that, I urge you to go back and reread the series. If you think either one of these two fighters is getting no diff, you should go back, reread it, and pay very close attention to the narrative. Gojo and Sukuna are two sides of the coin, and if and when they do fight, it will really come down to the wire. We will see some really dirty, underhanded tactics here going down. But that is everything from me. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please make sure to like and subscribe, and let me know what you thought of it in the comments down below. And as always, catch you guys all in the next one. Much love, big kisses, peace.